So our second presentation, welcome if you're just joining us to the session on pragmatics. Our second presentation is Matthew Pollock from Indiana University, and today the presentation is on politics and politeness under COVID, second person plural forms role in peninsular Spanish identity construction.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'll give you guys a bit of a spoiler, and while the COVID stuff feels relevant, it doesn't actually end up being statistically significant in a meaningful way. But I thought that is nonetheless the time period that I'm looking at, so I thought it was worthwhile to include. All right, so to sort of set the stage, social media serves an important role to allow politicians to pass along messages, connect with their voters, and Peninsular Spanish forms of address include vosotros as well as an informal second person plural, plus ustedes for formal context, as well as in use with strangers. But there's research to show that speakers of the Andalusian variety in particular have the option to mix forms. So ustedes sois, vosotros están. And so these two things are sort of combined in the current study, where I'm examining social and politeness and how they are associated with the second person plural to determine how these norms differ over geographical space and potentially over time as well. I'm trying to contribute to an understanding of political speech in Peninsular Spanish, as well as politeness norms associated with the Spanish second person plural in the South, which previous studies have said essentially merits further study because we don't know too much about them. I am examining Twitter posts from 9 politicians in Spain, balanced by gender, party, and region. One is the Partido Popular, the PP, I'll refer to it sometimes as the Conservative Party, and the Partido Socialista Obrero Español, the PSOE, which is the Liberal Party. I coded for violations to and observances of positive and negative social face following some previous research on computer-mediated communication, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. So, to look back at the previous literature, first for computer-mediated discourse and political discourse, authors like Herring and Andrewtsopoulos talk about the way that social media is a good space to look at identity construction. It's very easy to access a lot of this data, and it's a space where people are presenting themselves. They are putting out things at the topical to the microlinguistic level that's worthy of examination. Vivas Marquez and Ridao Rodrigo look at peninsular politeness and identity construction, showing that while Facebook seems to be a site with greater discourtesy, Twitter has a lot less offensive language and is overall less aggressive in peninsular Spanish. And then generally in the sort of sociolinguistic literature, users are seen as modifying their speech to accommodate their interlocutor and craft messages for specific audiences. So there is some research, for example, in Murcian Spanish. Hernandez Campoy and Cutias Espinosa interviewed a politician who essentially identified that she was making linguistic choices to craft her political identity in the press and in speeches. So the question is if this is also happening in computer-mediated communication, and if politeness has some role in this. In the realm of sociolinguistics and political discourse, politicians have been shown to engage in a very agentive process that helps them to demonstrate solidarity with other voters, to sidestep norms, and to navigate indexical fields in their community. There's research, for example, in Scotland. Halu, Friskley, and Scobie find that political party is an important feature in linguistic variation. Members of the Labour Party in Scotland followed London norms that they had access to, whereas members of the National Party did not. Pollock and Wheeler looked at an Andalusian female politician and found that left-leaning politicians, especially women, can use regional features at higher rates, possibly as a way to connect with certain voters. And there's just been other research in general in computer-mediated discourse involving either Swedish or French, and showing how politicians differ from their constituents, but also do create their own identity and voice online. In the realm of pragmatics and politeness, tying all the way back to Brown and Levinson, social face is comprised of 2 parts. There's a negative face, which is independence-focused, and a positive face that is self-image focused. Herring, in several studies, this was the initial one, sort of applies that to the social media context, using observances and violations to give a, not quite binary, but at least a coding to all of these productions to determine how things are violated or observed in the social media sphere. In this web forum, she looks at women tended to favor compliments, and men were more likely to flame or use insults as a form of virtual gatekeeping. So, to return us to Spain, vosotros is described as the most frequent second-person plural pronoun in much of the peninsula, according to Bermejo and others, but ustedes is prominent in Andalusia. Bermejo notes that ustedes is often used more than vosotros as a subject pronoun in Andalusia, especially in the West. This is based on results from a linguistic atlas. And broadly speaking about Andalusian Spanish, Viena Ponsoda and Avila Munoz talk about variation in Andalusia being affected not only by national norms and expectations, but also by local and regional norms. What is Seville doing? What is Granada doing? Which also have certain degrees of overt and covert prestige that influence the way people speak. So, the overall takeaways that I'd like to have from this, first of all, how frequently do politicians employ vosotros versus ustedes on their verified Twitter accounts? Second, to what extent do social and politeness factors influence use? What does this tell us about production norms? And three, looking at individuals, how does a qualitative analysis support the quantitative one? What politeness norms do individuals tend to follow, and why? All right, so the methods, first of all, as a justification for Twitter, it's been in the news a lot recently, but it's essentially a micro-blogging website that allows for professional verified accounts. You can tweet, you can retweet, and you can respond to other tweets. So those are the three sort of functions you can do through Twitter. And post brevity could contribute to an increased number of posts. Many of these politicians have 2 to 5 posts per day on average. There's open access to all these materials as well. So unlike some platforms like Instagram or Facebook, where you might have to be friends to be able to access content, Twitter basically opens itself up very easily and provides access to the most recent 3,200 tweets a user has posted. So here is the group of politicians. This includes a balanced group based on Madrid versus Seville, based on political party, based on gender, somewhat based on age, although this is a little bit harder to control for among politicians, as well as posting years. And I'll draw your attention to the posting years in particular. You'll notice that some politicians go all the way back to 2017, others are only from 2020 or 2021. Because there's only access to the most recent 3,200 tweets, when I collected in 2021 and in 2022, that was essentially going back as far as possible. Politicians who tweet more have a less lengthy history that's accessible. All right, so, and as for second person plural pronoun selection, pronoun use provides an indicator of second versus third person preference or reference. So Bermejo mentions that a ustedes tends to be used instead of se in a lot of cases in order to specify that this is not a reference to ellos or the third person. Therefore, I was really just looking for ustedes when I was coding for all markers of the second person not using vosotros. So if ustedes was present in a tweet, that would be flagged as an ustedes. Se, le, su is often too confusing to determine if it's second person plural or third person plural, and so those were often rejected unless they happened alongside instances of vosotros. All different instances of vosotros were coded because they were unique enough. But if there was a tweet that had vosotros and forms of ustedes, that was then considered on a case-by-case basis to see if there was form mixing at play. So some examples. Mis mejores deseos para vosotros y vuestras familias. So my best wishes for you and your families using vosotros in both. Ustedes no se defienden a la clase trabajadora. You don't defend the working class with ustedes. Ustedes sois nuestros héroes. You are our heroes. So this is a form mixing case. And then finally, one that looks like form mixing, but in the end was excluded. Gracias a las personas que han participado en estas misiones por vuestra gran labor. There's enough cases where there is a direction towards some third person group of people that then switches to the second person, that this first half was excluded just because it was too unclear as to whether this would be ellos or whether it would be ustedes. All right, as far as politeness goes, based on Herring, there were 5 possible outcomes. So this included instances of no politeness, often when information was being conveyed without any real way to clearly determine if politeness was associated. So in this one, this afternoon, I release a new video blog. You can see it in a half hour. It's not really demanding or requesting anything of people. For positive observances, those were compliments to images. So for example here, I know you do it and you do it well, proud to be one of your colleagues. This was a compliment to this other person for what they're doing. That was a positive observance. Positive violations would be insults. So that's what you would like, that we would be unable to criticize or speak freely. By the way, quiet is written with a Q. So this is sort of attacking the way that this person is writing, as well as what this person would allow this politician to say or not say. Negative observances, these are instances of mitigation, often with could or something along those lines. We invite those of you who can attend this show of support dedicated to the memory of terrorism victims. So this is not demanding somebody do something, but rather just inviting individuals. And finally, negative violation, this would be more along the lines of demands or commands. So here, stop using the term transphobia, it's simply false. So because it's essentially imposing on some other user's free will or independence. Okay, so finally moving into the data analysis, second person plural use was analyzed based on social characteristics, which included gender, political party, city of origin, age, and name, information about the medium, including the tweet type that I mentioned earlier and the year of posting, and linguistic and pragmatic factors related to ustedes and vosotros, including form mixing, politeness, syntactic function, and addressee. And a mixed effect logistic regression was created in Arbol to determine which factors influence selection of vosotros and ustedes. So very quickly, I'll go through this. The dependent variable was either ustedes or vosotros. The independent variables included male or female, conservative or liberal, Madrid or Seville, tweets or replies, mixing, no mixing, or cases where there was only a single form and so there was no possibility for mixing to occur, positive or negative violations or observances or no politeness, subject pronouns, object pronouns, verbs, and possessive pronouns. Addressees could include political supporters, opponents, tweets that were posted in memoriam of somebody who passed away, which was frequent during COVID, voters and special interest groups. And then year of posting and the speaker age were continuous. And finally, a random effect, speaker name was included to help control for individual variation that possibly might influence the way that one specific person might act. All right, so now to look at the results. This is the breakdown of the data. Very quickly, I'm going to bring us down here to the bottom. Total number of tweets that were analyzed with 38,700. However, retweets, which are somebody else's language that you essentially are just putting back out there, were removed because they were not an example of these politicians' actual speech. So that left 27,800. And tweets that actually had instances of ustedes and vosotros was 1,100. That's roughly 3% of the tweets had some instance of the second person plural. 1,700 total tokens came from those 1,100 tweets. All right, and so I'm going to just go through some of the descriptive stats and sort of show what's going on before we get to the logistic regression here. So first, in terms of syntactic function, subject pronouns have the highest rate of ustedes use. It's very infrequent to use the possessive. And meanwhile, for political party, we see that specifically conservatives show a high rate of ustedes use, especially with the subject pronoun. Okay, looking at tweet type, we see that there's a high use of ustedes in replies directed at specific individuals, and that there is a slight increase for city in ustedes use among Seville politicians and a much higher rate of ustedes use among Madrid politicians. Looking now at politeness, ustedes was by far most used in the case of violations, both positive and negative. Vosotros was nearly categorical, on the other hand, for observances. Right, and then for gender, women tended to use more violations of negative politeness using ustedes, whereas men tend to have more violations of positive politeness using ustedes. Looking now at addressee, the use of ustedes was low in the case of all but political opponents, which seems to suggest that there's a clear connection here with insulting behavior or some sort of distance that's being imposed. The opponents were included both politicians who were from the opposite party, as well as individuals who had clearly voiced their lack of support for the views of this. So anybody who was not a supporter of this politician's views. And then for age, we see overall the older speakers, which was roughly half of the sample, were more likely to use ustedes across all groups. The year of the post, as I mentioned, it's interesting that this did happen during the COVID years because there were a couple of things that I would like to look at qualitatively, including public service messages, such as orders to stay indoors, quarantine, get shots, which would have fallen under some violations of negative politeness, depending on the wording, as well as just information being conveyed about what's happening with the state of the country. We do see that the use of ustedes peaked in 2020 in instances of violation and then dropped off over time. So that's another trend that is interesting, but not exactly clear what's going on there. In terms of form mixing, so in cases where a single second person plural pronoun was used, ustedes was rare. In the remaining cases, women were much more likely to use ustedes overall. All right, so moving to the logistic regression here. So this was the use of ustedes across the 1700 tokens. For tweet type, replies tended to favor use of ustedes, which makes sense. This would be directly pointed towards some individual who has spoken to this politician rather than just a general sort of comment. Form mixing, so single form tweets tended to disfavor use of ustedes. Politeness, all but negative observances tended to favor use of ustedes. Syntactic functions, subject pronouns and verbs favored it. And for addressees, political opponents, as we saw, favored it, as that was a considerably different trend. But I will note that the R squared value here, this is describing about 73% of variation, but there's about 10% that's in the total that comes from the random effect. So the speakers also have some role in variation in this model. So I want to look at them briefly before I move into the qualitative results. So there's considerable variation occurring across these speakers, anywhere from 1 to 82% use of ustedes. And we see here that the highest producers included Antonio Ramirez de Arellano, who only had 6 tweets, but 18 total tokens of second person plural. And then 2 women, both of whom had considerably more tweets, around 100, with a very high rate of ustedes use. All of the rest of the politicians had fewer than 10 total uses of ustedes, and which represented less than 20% of the overall tokens. So these 3 that I'm going to look a little bit more in depth at. It's also worth noting that these politicians had considerably higher rates of politeness violations than most of the rest. So that was what they tended to be doing, whereas they were not observing social face. So I'm going to start with Antonio Ramirez, who had relatively few tweets. All of his tweets essentially were used to direct readers to information. So if you want to entertain yourselves, look for this. I ask you to take the opportunity to do this. Now take a look for these things. So it's relatively few, and it's varying degrees of politeness with requesting people to go look for information, but always or almost always using ustedes in these messages. The other two are more interesting, I think. So Cristina Cifuentes was the former president of Madrid until 2018, as well as party leader. She was charged with corruption, retired from politics in disgrace in mid-2018, and most of these tweets are coming from the 2019 to 2020 time period for her. So these are her trying to take on political rivals who have lashed out at her. So here we have, no, Mrs. Vice President, the problem is that in the middle of economic catastrophe, you have ... as well as a lot of online harassment as a result of these corruption charges that she's trying to fight back against. So I am in support of the Allied soldiers that shed their blood, sacrificing their lives on the beaches of Normandy to free us from Nazism in Europe. For you now, fascist is anyone who thinks differently, tremendously irresponsible. So trying to fight back with, the typical Nazi response here almost. So yes, we have this individual who is doing these things to protect her face to some extent, but also to sort of take on these people. And I'll talk about this in a little bit more depth at the end. Finally, Teresa Jimenez Becerril. She is a civilian politician who, interestingly, her brother was killed by the terror group ETA in 1998. And so a lot of her attacking posts tend to be towards people who have not taken a hard enough stance on ETA. So we have an example here. Why, Mr. Marlaska? Spaniards owe nothing to ETA, and you should ask yourself if you all owe them something. So this almost implication that this individual is associated with a terror group. But she also has a lot of instances of mixing forms, about 10%, which is one of the highest in the group. So she says here, you won't be alone. Millions of other Spaniards will be with you in Alsasua, and we switch between vosotros and ustedes. So Pollock, in a previous study, found that phonetically, this speaker also had a really high rate of ceseo, which is a typical Seville phonetic feature, more so than 15 other politicians from Andalusia, which possibly suggests that there's an identity she's trying to construct as being a Sevillana, somebody who belongs in this area. All right. Now, to move on back to the research questions. So how frequently do politicians employ vosotros and ustedes on their Twitter accounts? Vosotros is very frequent in Madrid. Only Cristina Cifuentes is using it more than 6% of the time. In Andalusia, there's a bit of a split. 3 speakers use it at a very high rate. However, Antonio Ramirez and Teresa Jimenez Becerril use it much less. Following Bermejo, there's also a greater use of ustedes as a subject pronoun in Seville than in Madrid, about 10% different. Ustedes serves as a marker of politeness and distance, helping to mitigate the strength of the social face violation that accompanies it. So this follows expectations of politeness on Twitter, found in other Spanish research. Interestingly, compared to Herring, from a very early stage in the internet, really in '94, there were no instances of flaming behavior, but this is probably also due to the public nature of these speakers. As politicians, they use politeness rather than direct insults or swearing to attack their opponents. Question 2, to what extent do social and politeness factors influence use? What does this tell us? So social factors are not at a level of statistical significance here. I think because the speakers are treated as random effects and it's a small cohort, that may neutralize differences of gender, political party, city, and age. But I think future research should explore if tendencies related to political and social norms, like what Hallu, Friskin, and Scobie found in Scotland, will also hold true in Spain. I think a larger cohort could do that. With respect to factors related to the medium, year of posting was not found to be significant, but tweet type showed a marked difference in second-person pronoun selection. So replies...
Sorry, 2 minutes.
Thank you. Replies directed at individuals were more likely to be hostile, and therefore also more likely to use ustedes. All 4 of the pragmatic and linguistic factors conditioned use, so posts with multiple mixed or unmixed forms, all but the observance of negative politeness, subject pronouns and verbs, and tweets directed at political opponents all tended to favor ustedes use. And then finally, how does a qualitative analysis support the quantitative one? What did these individuals do? So we see that there's a couple of different tactics that I want to explore a little bit more deeply in a qualitative analysis. Ramirez is conveying information, is a liberal Seville politician, and there's a question here if this is reflective of his spoken Spanish or an indication that he maybe views social media as a more formal sphere requiring use of ustedes. Cristina Cifuentes, this is post-corruption charges and distancing from visibility. There's less importance for her to maintain her public image, fewer consequences if she's seen insulting others. So she insults and verbally attacks harassers and opposing politicians. And finally, Teresa Jimenez Becerril, she's against the terror group ETA. She's also form mixing and maybe is identifying herself as Sevillana. So finally, in conclusion, speakers differ based on pragmatic and individual decisions. General audiences, that's the tweets, differ from the specific ones, the replies made to individuals, and those with opposing views, opponents, tend to receive an increased degree of ustedes. Variable second person plural variation forms an important part of politeness and social face management and identity work in Peninsular Spanish. Some questions that this raises for further study: does politeness differ across a governing and opposition party member? So, for example, Jimenez Becerril, she mixes forms, uses seseo, violates politeness in 44% of cases, whereas Susana Diaz, the former president of Andalusia, uses less than 2% of ustedes and has fewer than 10% violations. So is politeness tied potentially to a degree of power? Future research can explore the comparability of written and spoken data as well. There are questions about whether major politicians actually write their own tweets. To what extent is this actually their speech? I think looking at how they speak and looking at their instances of discourse would be able to indicate better if this is representative. And finally, these results speak to the relationship between forms of address and Peninsular Spanish politeness through the analysis of a computer-mediated context. And that's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Super interesting. Okay, are there any questions? Oh, yes. Alvaro.
Yes, it's a very interesting presentation, which kind of, I'm not sure if the word is correct, debunks or at least opposes our traditional understanding of the use of ustedes, because normally what we're told is that, or what we know, is that Madrid and the North uses ustedes only when it is a formal context, as opposed to the South, where they have a non-native vosotros, right? Because they have to learn at school.
Right.
It's not native to them. And here you are seeing that the South, in both cases, they're using the ustedes for some sort of a distance marker, right? Regardless of what's their native second person plural pronoun.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that seems to be the case. And it's interesting because I had originally gone into this, and last year I had a briefer presentation with a smaller data set that wasn't really politeness focused, looking at this and just sort of thinking at the outset that there would be a lot of ustedes in the South and a lot of vosotros in the North. And what I found was that, that doesn't seem to be the case. What's going on here? And so I shifted tacks this year to look more at politeness and amplify the data a bit to be able to figure out that, yeah, they do seem to have similar approaches to the forms of address. It's just that potentially individual situations are differing, and maybe in the South there is a greater use of ustedes, but they still have this similar meaning of, like you say, distance and politeness, potentially.
So the vuestras mercedes is still alive there, as opposed to Latin America, right?
Exactly.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Cesar.
Question. Hi, Mike. I enjoyed your presentation, Matthew.
Thank you.
Quick question. To what extent, the ustedes is a marker of formality and respect to express distance.
Right.
But in that context, I wonder to what extent this is really a marker of politeness, or is it just the expected behavior? I mean, how to what are your thoughts to say that it's a marker of politeness? If we use as we know, the Brennan Levinson's theory, it's a marker of negative politeness. If we put aside the theory, it's just basically a marker of distance. Right. It's a distancing device. Right. So to what extent in your data this expresses politeness?
Yeah, so I sort of theorized at one point that potentially it's a way to be polite insofar as you are maybe softening the blow of then saying that you're a Nazi or something along those lines. That it's a way to show some degree of respect for this person in that you are distant enough from them but then sort of following up with something that's much less polite. So I do agree that, though, as far as distance versus politeness goes, it seems like, especially when addressing other politicians may not have any real disrespect being shown, but just like, you all from your side are doing this thing, and that does seem to be almost polite distance. Whereas when it's Cristina Cifuentes, for example, attacking these people who are harassing her, that just seems to be distance in order to allow her to lob these insults.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bruno, yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for the presentation. It was super interesting. Following what Cesar was saying, I think it was not just a fact of distance, but we have to consider also that they are public people, they're politicians, basically, yeah. So they also want to show like a distance, but in the political spectrum, like, hey, I'm different from you.
Right.
And that's why might they use the ustedes. Like, I'm not the same as you, and my voters must know it. So that can be another thing. Like, they are not showing politeness, probably. What they are showing is like, hey, we're different.
Yeah.
And that's why they use. So that's the way that they perceive it, probably.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. To sort of set up this other politician as a stranger, as somebody you barely understand, because their perspective is so different from yours.
Yeah, especially in Spain, like, it's super polarized. So
it's something that thank you very much. Yeah, it's something that I'd like to explore further, specifically how political parties differ. Victor, I see you have your hand up. Yeah.
Hi. So thanks for the presentation. I enjoyed it a lot as well. I was wondering if I found it also curious that Cristina Cifuentes has such a high percentage of ustedes, because I think she's from Madrid.
She is, yeah.
And I was wondering if from your data you found that in some of those uses of ustedes, it was also not only to show distance, but also some type of, let's say, off-record impoliteness, such as like the one that Culpeper mentioned, let's say some using of sarcasm. Because when I was thinking about how someone who's not from Andalusia or the area of Sevilla could be using ustedes to show rather sarcasm as well. So I don't know if you had any of that in your data.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think that Cristina Cifuentes is potentially a point where if I turn this into an article, I would want to have a subsection just really focusing on her, because unfortunately, to some extent, I wasn't able to get her Twitter data from prior to her fall from grace. So it would be interesting to see what she was doing in 2015, 2016, 2017. I assume she'd be much more similar to somebody like Pedro Sanchez or Juanma Moreno or someone else who has a degree of power, maybe is like other people in her party. But since I collected in 2021 and then 2022, I could only reach back to about 2018 or 2019. So almost everything I have is after the like her role as a public figure continued, but she had nothing to really fight for. She probably will not go back into politics, so she doesn't have to like defend herself in the same way. But I think with that said, there are a lot of instances of ustedes being used for sarcasm. I hadn't really mentally positioned it in that way, but there's one in particular that I almost provided as an example, where she was essentially saying, I've received so many threats over the last year. I would never wish anybody in my life harm, but you all are terrible. So you all, ustedes, shut up, essentially. And so there's just this degree of both attacking and sarcasm and anger, and it's all sort of mixed up there in specifically what she's doing, which I think explains why she's so different from the other Madrid politicians. That she's essentially in a new category almost. She's not really a politician anymore. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, Bruno.
So following on this Cristina Cifuentes, I think you can find many other Madrid speakers that they are very active in Twitter, like the current Presidenta of Comunidad de Madrid. I think she's also like super into Twitter, so probably she uses, and you can also check on that.
Yeah.
And the predecessor, how was it? Oh my God, I forgot the names. They all were like super active on Twitter, so probably you can find like tons of Madrilean.
Yeah.
Twitter, and also like the new presidente of Andalusia. I think he's
Yeah, he's
active.
also very active. Yeah, it's interesting because a lot
Yeah,
of
yeah.
oh yeah. Thank you. I was just gonna say that it's interesting that there have been several of them now that I've looked at that are also professors or work at universities, and so seeing like the two sides of their Twitter because they're doing political tweets and they're also talking to their deans and president of the university thanking them for this or that. So there is this divide even among Twitter that it's a little bit difficult to try and separate out. But I think that, yeah, as far as people who use Twitter, I have yet to find more than a handful of politicians who really don't have a very active presence in Spain, both in the south and in Madrid. So I think that this could expand. It's a question of how much time and how many people you want to include. Because as I said, with 30,000 tweets, it was about 1,000 that were analyzable, which is a pretty good ratio, I would say, especially since it's so easy to pull these tweets out. You just have to keep on going maybe once a year and collecting them, and you'll have a corpus in 10 years of, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of tweets. Yeah, thank you.